The night was black and merciless, a void of water and sky where even the stars dared not shine. The convoy pressed on through the freezing Atlantic, a fragile line of merchant ships, their hulls creaking against the waves, carrying Britain's lifeblood across a sea that had already claimed hundreds. Each vessel bore cargo that could mean survival or starvation: tanks, ammunition, food, and steel, all stacked high in silent holds. On deck, sailors wrapped themselves in blankets, eyes scanning the darkness, hands clenched around rails, waiting for what could come without warning. Beneath the surface, the hunters moved silently. German U-boats had begun their deadly patrols, steel leviathans slipping through the cold water, men listening to the rhythmic pulse of propellers above. The control rooms glowed dim red, instruments alive with the vibrations of the ocean. Torpedoes were armed, targets acquired, and then the command came: fire. A torpedo slipped through the water, a streak unseen, unstoppable. The explosion tore through the night. Flames leapt into the sky as the bow of a merchant ship lifted and sank, tossing sailors into icy water. Chaos reigned as the convoy scattered, escorts scrambling to locate threats, searchlights cutting across black waves that hid death beneath. The cold was immediate, biting through clothing, stealing strength from those in the water. Screams echoed over the roar of engines and wind. The war had come to the oceans, not with glory or ceremony, but with terror and unrelenting menace. Long before this night, the world had been moving toward conflict. Germany had rebuilt its navy in defiance of treaties, quietly testing submarines and surface ships, dreaming of vengeance. Britain clung to its empire, proud and determined, yet aware of its vulnerabilities. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched with apprehension, still holding to isolationist hopes, still unprepared for the scale of what was coming. When Poland fell in September 1939, the seas became a battleground almost unseen. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun. Convoys zigzagged through fog and darkness, while destroyers and corvettes hunted shadows, relying on sound, training, and courage. The technology was crude, radar was limited, sonar a new tool still in its infancy. Men counted on instinct, on vigilance, on endurance, and on each other. Every ship lost was more than steel. Each carried families, letters, dreams, hopes. Every torpedo, every shell carried human cost. The war on the Atlantic was relentless. Winter brought freezing storms that tested both ship and sailor. Waves towered like mountains, spray frozen by the wind. Men suffered frostbite, exhaustion, and despair, yet they pressed on. Convoys became rolling fortresses, heavily armed but never invincible. U-boat commanders learned the tactics of hunting and evasion. Merchant captains learned resilience and cunning. The ocean was a teacher of cruelty and patience alike. By 1940, the toll was staggering. Hundreds of ships had been sunk. Tens of thousands of sailors had perished, swallowed by the waves or trapped within their vessels. Britain faced shortages, rationing, and the constant threat of starvation. Yet the spirit of the Navy endured. Escorts grew wiser, convoys moved with greater coordination, and slowly, imperceptibly, the Allies began to adapt. Depth charges, convoy formations, and air patrols began to tip the balance. Victory was not yet in sight, but the seeds were planted. Even as Europe burned with the clash of armies, the Atlantic remained a battlefield of its own. The sea was silent, vast, and indifferent, yet it had become a stage for heroism and horror alike. Sailors learned the price of survival. Convoy duty became an exercise in endurance, in waiting, in constant vigilance against an enemy that struck without warning. Each night brought the potential for loss, and each dawn brought the fragile relief of survival. In 1941, the war widened. Italy entered the conflict, Japan advanced across Asia, and the global nature of the struggle became undeniable. The Atlantic convoys continued, unyielding, a lifeline to a besieged island nation. The U-boats prowled, ever more cunning, relying on wolf-pack tactics to overwhelm defenses. Yet the resolve of the Allies hardened. Coordination improved. Technology advanced. The tide, though barely perceptible, began to turn. This was only the beginning. The Atlantic had become a proving ground where courage and cunning clashed in the darkness, and where men learned that the sea could be both ally and executioner. The battles would grow larger, more complex, stretching across oceans and continents. Ships would sink, fleets would rise and fall, and the nature of naval warfare itself would be forever changed. But for now, the night was full of fire, of ice, and of human determination. In the black Atlantic, the gathering storm had arrived, and the world was about to be swept into its fury. The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned with an almost deceptive calm over Pearl Harbor. The sun glinted off calm waters, palm trees swayed gently, and sailors moved about their duties with the routine ease of a peaceful Sunday. Letters were written, decks scrubbed, breakfast eaten, and the world seemed ordinary. But in the sky, dark shadows were moving, and in a matter of minutes the ordinary would become unimaginable. Without warning, Japanese planes swept in from the horizon. They struck with the precision of a predator, each dive calculated, each bomb released with fatal intent. Battleships, symbols of American naval pride, erupted in flame. The Arizona vanished in a roar of fire and smoke. Smoke billowed into the sky, carrying with it the lives of over 1,000 men trapped inside. The roar of engines and explosions filled the harbor as sailors leapt into the water clutching life jackets, hopping against hope to survive. The Pacific War had begun in a single, violent morning. Across Asia, Japan advanced with relentless speed. Malaya fell. The Philippines, British Borneo, and the Dutch East Indies succumbed to rapid assault. Their forces moved as if the war had already been won. On the water, Japanese carriers projected air power with terrifying efficiency, their planes striking targets far from sight of the enemy. Battleships and cruisers became vulnerable, their traditional supremacy eroded by the rise of the aircraft carrier. The oceans had changed, and the rules of engagement no longer relied solely on guns and steel. The United States, stunned by the sudden devastation, rallied to respond. Shipyards worked day and night, assembling new carriers, battleships, and escort vessels. Pilots trained in frantic shifts, learning the art of naval aviation, the new way the seas would be dominated. Convoys, once mere transports, were armed and prepared to defend against enemy air power. Every day brought new threats, and the grim awareness that survival would demand more than courage. It would demand innovation, endurance, and sacrifice. Early clashes tested the limits of this new form of warfare. The Battle of the Coral Sea became the first engagement where opposing fleets fought without ever seeing each other, a strange and frightening concept. Planes became the weapons, carriers the new capital ships, and the horizon itself was no longer a boundary. Ships that had once been kings of the sea were now sitting targets, vulnerable to unseen attacks from above. Men adapted or perished, learning that the future of naval combat belonged to the seas as much as the waves. The war in the Pacific was brutal and unforgiving. Islands burned, cities fell, and supply lines were threatened across thousands of miles of ocean. Sailors endured days without fresh water, weeks without seeing land, and nights under constant threat of attack. Each engagement was a test of nerve, skill, and resolve. Every victory and loss reshaped the strategies of both sides. The Japanese expansion seemed unstoppable, yet cracks were beginning to show. Intelligence leaks, overextended supply lines, and the growing industrial might of the United States promised a turning point. Meanwhile, on islands scattered across the Pacific, local populations were caught between the tides of war. Villages were destroyed, harbors occupied, and the civilian cost of the conflict became impossible to ignore. The seas, once highways of trade and connection, had become barriers and battlefields. Survival depended not only on ships and guns, but on courage, ingenuity, and a steadfast refusal to surrender. By mid-1942, the first glimmers of hope appeared. U.S. naval forces, bruised but unbroken, began a push back. Reconnaissance and intelligence operations revealed the movements of enemy carriers. Pilots trained in secrecy struck with precision. Small victories hinted at a larger truth. The balance of power could shift. even in the face of overwhelming enemy strength. The Pacific, vast and treacherous, was no longer solely a stage for Japanese dominance. The stage was set for the battles that would define the war in the Pacific. Coral Sea and Midway loomed on the horizon, places where courage, strategy, and the sheer will to survive would collide. Aircraft would outgun guns, determination would outmatch numbers, and the men who faced these battles would etch their names into history. The oceans had ignited, and the world was watching, knowing that the tides of war had forever changed. As the smoke of Pearl Harbor drifted over the harbor, as survivors clung to rafts in the burning waters, the United States and its allies realized the scale of the struggle ahead. The war would be fought not only on land but across thousands of miles of ocean, where the fate of nations depended on every ship, every plane, and every sailor who dared to face the relentless fury of the sea. The Pacific had awakened, and the war would soon sweep across it in fire, blood, and steel. May 1942 arrived with tension thick over the South Pacific. The waters stretched endlessly, turquoise in calm sunlight, yet beneath the surface and high above in the sky, storm clouds of war gathered. Two fleets, vast and powerful, were moving without ever seeing one another, carriers and cruisers threading across the ocean in a deadly dance. This would be the first battle fought entirely by aircraft, a clash that would signal the turning of the tides. The Battle of the Coral Sea began in confusion and uncertainty. Japanese forces sought to invade Port Moresby, a strategic point that would extend their reach across the Pacific. The Americans, alerted by intelligence and desperate to prevent expansion, positioned their carriers in a counter-strike. The planes took off from steel decks, roaring into the sky, wings catching the sunlight as they crossed hundreds of miles of open water. They sought targets they could not see, releasing bombs and torpedoes guided by skill, instinct, and courage. Explosions erupted on ships miles apart. Smoke and fire curled into the clouds, a grim testimony to the new nature of naval combat. For the first time, fleets clashed without ever exchanging fire from their guns directly. The battle was as much about calculation and anticipation as about bravery. Pilots were tested beyond limits, navigating turbulence, anti-aircraft fire, and enemy fighters. On both sides, losses were heavy, but the tide of war was beginning to show that air power had become the deciding force. Just weeks later, the world turned its eyes to Midway. The Japanese planned to eliminate the American carrier threat and consolidate dominance over the Pacific. Their fleet moved like a dark shadow across the water, confident in its power. American intelligence, however, had broken codes, and the defenders waited in silence, hidden beneath waves and clouds, ready for the strike. This would be a confrontation unlike any other, where strategy and courage intertwined in a deadly embrace. On June 4th, planes lifted from decks, engines screaming into dawn. Dive bombers and torpedo planes pursued the massive Japanese carriers, while fighters clashed in midair, weaving death through the sky. Ships erupted in flame as bombs struck decks, igniting ammunition and consuming steel. The precision and courage of the Americans turned the tide. 4 Japanese carriers, symbols of imperial might, were destroyed in hours, a catastrophic blow that the enemy could not replace. The Battle of Midway became the pivot of the Pacific War. Japan's expansion was halted. Its fleet, once considered invincible, was broken. The Americans had demonstrated that intelligence, courage, and air power could overcome sheer numbers. For the first time, hope shifted from survival to victory. Sailors and pilots, scarred by loss but strengthened by triumph, understood the stakes. The war was far from over, but the momentum had changed. Coral Sea and Midway also showed the price of innovation and adaptation. Battleships were no longer the central instruments of naval supremacy. Carriers and aircraft dictated the rules. Men adapted quickly, learning the new demands of a war fought across air and sea simultaneously. The Pacific was no longer a series of islands and shipping lanes. It had become a theater of speed, intelligence, and deadly precision. The human cost remained immense. Hundreds of lives were lost in both engagements. Pilots fell into the ocean, ships burned, and survivors clung to rafts, waiting for rescue that sometimes came too late. The sea collected its tribute relentlessly. Yet from these losses, lessons were learned. New tactics were developed, more efficient coordination implemented, and the resolve of the Allied forces hardened. After Midway, the Japanese Navy never fully recovered its former dominance. The Allies gained a foothold, a chance to press forward. The oceans that had seemed hostile and unyielding became a proving ground for courage and strategy. Each engagement carried echoes of the battles that had come before and foreshadowed the greater conflicts still to come. The Pacific was vast, and the war across it would be brutal and unrelenting. Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, and the Marianas awaited, places where courage and endurance would be tested to the extreme. But for now, the victories at Coral Sea and Midway had shifted the balance, proving that intelligence, determination, and the daring of men willing to risk everything could turn the tide of war. The stage was set for a long struggle. The carriers had claimed their dominance. Air power was king. The lessons of the Coral Sea and Midway would echo through every subsequent battle, shaping strategy, inspiring courage, and marking the moment when the Allies first glimpsed the possibility of victory. The oceans had begun to bend to human will, but the storm was far from over. The next chapters of the war would demand every ounce of skill, resolve, and bravery that men could summon. The Atlantic in 1942 was a theater of relentless peril, a vast corridor of ice, fog, and storm where the fate of nations hung in the balance. Merchant convoys moved like fragile threads across the water, carrying the essential supplies that Britain and its allies required to survive. Each ship was a lifeline, each sailor a guardian of hope. Yet beneath the waves, the silent hunters of the German Kriegsmarine lurked, waiting, listening, ready to strike with deadly precision. The wolf packs emerged, coordinated groups of U-boats that moved as shadows across the sea. They struck with devastating efficiency, surrounding convoys, cutting off escape, and delivering sudden destruction. Torpedoes tore through hulls, sending steel and men into freezing waters. The cries of sailors were carried away by wind and waves, unheeded except by the desperate comrades racing to save them. The Atlantic had become a graveyard, yet survival was a stubborn necessity. For the Allies, the challenge was immense. Every convoy required careful planning, escort ships, air cover, and constant vigilance. Early technology was rudimentary. Radar and sonar offered limited protection, and many battles were won or lost in moments of instinct and courage. Destroyers and corvettes patrolled tirelessly, depth charges ready, sonar operators straining to detect the faintest echo of an unseen enemy. Nights were the worst. Darkness was absolute, punctuated by flashes of explosions, distant fires, and the haunting glow of sinking ships. Yet the men adapted. Convoys began to travel in tighter formations, air patrols extended, intelligence networks tracked U-boat movements, and countermeasures became more sophisticated. The Atlantic was no longer only a place of helpless vulnerability. It became a crucible of innovation, endurance, and relentless struggle. Each sinking taught a lesson, each narrow escape strengthened resolve. Men learned to navigate not only the waves but the constant tension, the knowledge that at any moment the sea could claim their lives. The battle was not only physical but mental. Captains calculated courses under pressure, radio operators deciphered coded messages, and every sailor endured the fear that accompanied each night. The U-boat threat forced constant vigilance, demanding total concentration and unyielding courage. Even routine tasks became acts of defiance against the ever-present menace. The Atlantic became a test of stamina, resourcefulness, and sheer willpower. By mid-1943, a shift began to emerge. Allied anti-submarine tactics improved, convoy coordination became more effective, and the introduction of long-range aircraft brought the skis into the battle. Depth charges grew more accurate, radar detection became more reliable, and U-boat losses mounted. Each engagement, each narrow victory, turned the tide slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet decisively. The wolf packs that had terrorized the Atlantic faced a new adversary, a combination of skill, technology, and relentless determination. The human cost remained staggering. Thousands of sailors perished, men who had only begun to comprehend the scale of the war and the ocean's capacity for cruelty. Ships were lost, cargoes destroyed, and families left in despair. Yet amidst the tragedy, stories of heroism emerged. Crews saved comrades, captains executed daring maneuvers, and pilots braved storms and enemy fire to keep supply lines open. Courage became the currency of survival, and the Atlantic the proving ground for endurance and ingenuity. Each battle, each convoy, each night at sea reinforced the importance of logistics and perseverance. Britain survived because men risked everything to maintain the lifelines across the ocean. The war in Europe and North Africa depended on these tenuous threads of supply, and every sunk U-boat, every protected convoy, carried strategic significance far beyond the waves. The sea itself became a weapon and a test, revealing both the vulnerability and the resilience of human endeavor. By late 1943, the momentum had shifted decisively. U-boat losses mounted, Allied anti-submarine tactics matured, and the Atlantic convoys sailed with increasing confidence. The wolf packs were no longer omnipotent, and the lifelines of Europe held firm. Yet the lessons were bitterly learned. The oceans demanded vigilance, courage, and sacrifice at every turn. Every victory in the Atlantic was paid for with the lives of men and the steel of ships, each sinking a reminder of the cost of survival. The Atlantic Gauntlet was more than a battle of ships. It was a contest of endurance, intelligence, and the human spirit against the relentless power of nature and a cunning enemy. The war at sea had evolved, reshaped by technology, strategy, and the bravery of those who dared to face it. The stage was set for larger conflicts, for the fleets of the Pacific, and for the moment when the industrial might of nations would clash openly in decisive battles. The oceans had claimed their share of sacrifice, but they had also revealed the strength of those who refused to surrender. The struggle for the Atlantic would continue, but the Allies were learning, adapting, and gaining strength. Ships once threatened by unseen predators began to carry hope instead of despair. Men understood that the ocean was both adversary and ally, that survival depended on courage, foresight, and unyielding resolve. The Atlantic had become a battlefield unlike any other, and the lessons learned there would echo through the rest of the war, shaping strategy, shaping victories, and shaping the destiny of nations. The Solomon Islands lay in the heart of the Pacific, a chain of jungles, coral reefs, and hidden harbors that would become the stage for one of the most grueling campaigns of the war. Guadalcanal, the first island of the chain to fall under Japanese occupation, became a symbol of both the stakes and the brutality of naval and land combat. The islands were small, but their control meant the difference between dominance of the Pacific and a prolonged Allied struggle. American forces landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, seeking to prevent Japan from using it as an airbase to threaten supply lines in Australia. From the very beginning, the campaign was one of attrition, endurance, and relentless pressure. The islands themselves offered no mercy. Dense jungle concealed enemy soldiers, while tropical heat and disease claimed men as surely as bullets. Every day became a fight for survival, every night a contest for dominance of the surrounding waters. The sea around the islands became a battlefield unlike any other. Night battles erupted regularly, where cruisers, destroyers, and smaller ships engaged in lightning strikes beneath the cloak of darkness. Torpedoes streaked through black waters, shells tore into steel, and sailors fought with a desperate intensity born of necessity. Radar was still new, and the ocean's darkness was both shield and danger. Men learned to trust their instincts and to act swiftly, because hesitation could mean death. Air power played a critical role, yet it came with limits. Fighters and bombers flew missions from carriers and hastily constructed airstrips, seeking to disrupt enemy movements and protect their own convoys. The air battles were intense, deadly, and exhausting. Pilots faced tropical storms, enemy fighters, and anti-aircraft fire, all while carrying the weight of strategy and the lives of their comrades below. Every mission was a gamble, every engagement a measure of skill and courage. The Japanese resisted fiercely, seeking to reclaim Guadalcanal and maintain their control over the Solomons. Reinforcements moved under cover of darkness, attempting to evade the growing strength of Allied forces. Supply lines became lifelines, contested fiercely by both sides. The struggle was relentless, with victories won and lost in hours, often at tremendous cost. Ships burned, men died, and the ocean claimed its due with unyielding consistency. The campaign revealed the emerging reality of modern naval warfare. Small ships, once considered secondary, proved essential in night actions. Destroyers moved in tight formations, launching torpedoes with deadly precision. Cruisers exchanged broadsides under the darkness, their crews relying on courage and training. The sea itself became a weapon, with reefs, currents, and tides influencing strategy as much as any enemy maneuver. Sailors endured unimaginable conditions. Sleep was a luxury, food was scarce, and disease was constant. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion took their toll alongside enemy fire, yet amidst the suffering, bravery shone through. Crews rescued comrades from burning decks, pilots pressed forward despite crippling injuries, and commanders made impossible decisions under relentless pressure. Guadalcanal became a crucible, forging skill, determination, and resilience. The psychological toll was immense. Men lived with constant awareness of the ocean's dangers, the enemy's presence, and the fragile nature of life at war. Each night brought the possibility of sudden death. Yet these conditions bred innovation. Radar-directed fire, coordinated airstrikes, and rapid response tactics developed in real time, giving the Allies an edge in knowledge and adaptation. Every engagement taught lessons that would carry into future campaigns. By early 1943, the tide began to turn. Japanese forces, stretched thin and unable to replace losses, were forced to retreat. Guadalcanal, once a symbol of enemy power, became a foothold for Allied operations. Control of the Solomons allowed the Allies to project air and naval power further into the Pacific, setting the stage for offensives that would strike deeper into occupied territory. The Solomon Islands campaign demonstrated the brutal reality of combined arms warfare at sea and on land. Naval battles and air engagements were inseparable from the struggle for territory, supplies, and survival. The campaign also revealed the importance of endurance, ingenuity, and unwavering resolve. Every victory was paid for with lives lost, every gain measured in suffering endured. Guadalcanal became more than a battle. It became a symbol of determination against overwhelming odds. The ocean surrounding it was alive with conflict, the jungle dense with danger, and the sky streaked with planes that carried the fate of men and nations. The lessons learned here, in night battles, carrier engagements, and desperate island defense, would echo throughout the Pacific. The stage was set for even larger clashes, where the full force of industrial power, strategy, and courage would collide on a scale never before seen. The Solomons had tested men to their limits and revealed both the cruelty and heroism inherent in naval warfare. The islands were small, but the struggle fought around them was vast. The courage displayed here, the endurance required, and the sacrifices made would define the Pacific campaign, shaping the course of the war and proving that no ocean, no matter how wide, could shield those who dared to face its fury. By 1943, the war at sea had grown into a contest of industrial might, strategy, and sheer human endurance. The oceans were no longer theaters of isolated engagements. Entire fleets moved across thousands of miles, their presence shaping the fate of continents. The Battle of the Atlantic had stabilized, but in the Pacific, a new chapter was beginning, where colossal warships and powerful carrier groups would clash in battles that tested courage, skill, and the limits of human resilience. The United States, fueled by an industrial surge unmatched in history, now fielded fleets capable of sustained operations across the Pacific. Carriers bristled with aircraft, battleships carried more firepower than ever before, and destroyers patrolled in tight formations, their crews trained to respond instantly to any threat. Each ship represented not only steel and engineering, but the lives and hopes of the men aboard and the nations behind them. The Japanese, still formidable, faced the consequences of prior defeats. Midway had shattered their carrier force. Guadalcanal had drained resources, yet their determination remained unbroken. They deployed fleets designed to counter the growing power of the Allies, and each engagement became a deadly contest of wills, where miscalculation could mean annihilation. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 exemplified this clash of leviathans. From sunrise, carriers launched waves of planes in a vast, coordinated attack across hundreds of miles of ocean. Fighters intercepted bombers, dive bombers tore through decks, and anti-aircraft guns roared in defiance. The sky became a battlefield, a storm of metal, fire, and determination, while below, ships maneuvered with precision, seeking to strike or evade. American pilots, battle-hardened and trained in unprecedented numbers, gained the upper hand. Japanese air formations, once confident and disciplined, were decimated in what would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of planes were destroyed, their pilots lost, leaving the Japanese Navy with irreplaceable losses in both personnel and morale. Yet the battle was not won without sacrifice. Ships took damage, men perished, and the sheer intensity of the engagement left no heart untouched by fear or loss. Naval engagements in this period demonstrated the evolution of strategy and technology. Radar, sonar, and improved communications allowed fleets to operate with coordination unimaginable only a few years earlier. Carriers became central, their aircraft dictating the terms of engagement. Battleships, once supreme, provided support but were no longer the deciding factor. Night attacks, submarine harassment, and reconnaissance from the air combined to form a complex and lethal battlefield across open ocean and island chains. Industrial capacity proved decisive. The United States produced ships, planes, and munitions at a rate the Japanese could not match. Every new ship joining the fleet represented the ability to project power, protect convoys, or strike enemy positions far from home shores. The war had become a contest not only of bravery and skill, but of production, logistics, and relentless application of resources. Yet human endurance remained at the core. Sailors faced long deployments, constant threat from air and sea, and the merciless conditions of the Pacific. Heat, storms, disease, and exhaustion tested every man. Pilots flew multiple sorties in a single day, risking life and limb to strike decisive blows. Crews of carriers, battleships, and destroyers labored around the clock, maintaining engines, guns, and communications. Courage was not only displayed in battle, but in the quiet perseverance of men, enduring the relentless demands of modern warfare. The Leviathan's clash also revealed the importance of tactical innovation. Coordinated air-sea attacks, night maneuvers, and fleet formations designed to maximize firepower while minimizing vulnerability became standard. Admirals learned to anticipate enemy movements, adapt to technology, and push their crews to perform beyond human expectation. Each victory, each loss, reshaped doctrine and strategy. By the end of 1944, the Japanese Navy was irreversibly weakened. The Allies controlled the seas, enabling successive invasions of key island strongholds and providing the platform to threaten the Japanese home islands themselves. Each battle demonstrated the scale of modern naval warfare, where industrial power, strategy, courage, and innovation collided to produce outcomes that could shape the course of history. The Leviathans of the ocean, the largest ships, the most powerful fleets, the bravest crews had tested each other in a crucible of fire, metal, and water. The ocean itself seemed to judge the balance of power, granting advantage to those who combined courage with planning, innovation with endurance. As the fleets moved forward, striking at enemy positions and defending newly acquired territory, The men aboard understood that they were participating in a war of unprecedented scale, a conflict where each decision could resonate across oceans and generations. The stage was now set for the final confrontations, for battles that would bring the war to the doorstep of Japan itself. The Leviathans had clashed, the power of industry and courage had been proven, and the Allies were ready to press their advantage. The Pacific, vast and unforgiving, awaited the next chapter in a struggle that would decide the fate of nations. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific had become a storm of fire, steel, and determination. The Allies were pressing forward relentlessly, moving from island to island, each capture bringing them closer to Japan itself. The naval battles now were not isolated engagements but parts of a vast, coordinated strategy. The men who sailed these oceans understood that the war had entered its final, most punishing phase, where every ship, every plane, and every decision carried the weight of nations. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 exemplified the scale and ferocity of these confrontations. It was the largest naval battle in history, a clash of fleets unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. American forces sought to liberate the Philippines and cut off Japan from its occupied territories in Southeast Asia. The Japanese, desperate to reverse their losses, deployed their remaining major warships in a final attempt to disrupt the advance. The ocean became a canvas of chaos. Carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft, their engines screaming into dawn. Torpedo bombers and dive bombers struck with precision and ferocity, while enemy fighters intercepted with lethal intent. Battleships exchanged salvo after salvo, shells tearing through steel, igniting fires, and sending clouds of smoke into the sky. Destroyers maneuvered with speed and skill, launching torpedoes and protecting larger vessels from relentless attacks. Every moment tested the courage and endurance of those aboard. Submarines played a deadly role, slipping silently through the waters to strike at unsuspecting targets. Depth charges and evasive maneuvers were constant, as both sides sought to gain the advantage in a battle fought across air, sea, and strategy. The fighting was brutal, intimate, and unrelenting, a testament to the evolution of naval warfare and the human capacity for endurance under extreme pressure. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of men perished in a single day, lost to fire, explosions, drowning, and the unforgiving sea. Yet amidst the carnage, acts of heroism emerged. Crews rescued shipmates from burning decks, pilots pressed forward despite overwhelming odds, and commanders executed daring maneuvers that would become lessons in naval history. Courage was not an abstract concept. It was the difference between life and death, between victory and disaster. The battle also demonstrated the culmination of strategic learning over years of conflict. Radar-directed gunfire, coordinated airstrikes, and effective use of intelligence allowed the Allies to overcome even numerically strong opponents. Japanese forces, though skilled and determined, were unable to replace losses or counter the industrial and technological superiority of the Allies. Each engagement chipped away at their ability to wage war, moving the balance decisively in favor of the advancing forces. As the war neared its end, the naval campaigns extended to the very doorstep of Japan. The Battle of Okinawa became a harrowing prelude to the planned invasion of the homeland. Kamikaze attacks, night raids, and relentless bombardments tested both ships and crews. Sailors endured days without respite, braving suicide attacks and storms alike. Every ship that survived carried not only men but the promise of continued resistance and the hope of victory. Meanwhile, the scale of industrial production ensured that each loss could be replaced with a new ship, a new aircraft, and fresh crews ready to continue the fight. This capacity, combined with refined tactics and unbreakable resolve, meant that the Allied forces could sustain pressure relentlessly, overwhelming an exhausted enemy. The ocean had become both a proving ground and a crucible, shaping the war through fire, strategy, and sacrifice. By the spring of 1945, Japan's navy was a shadow of its former power. The seas that had once been a stage for Japanese dominance were now firmly controlled by the Allies. Amphibious assaults, carrier strikes, and submarine campaigns paved the way for air raids over the home islands. Every naval engagement had contributed to the inexorable advance toward the final act of the war. The last battles were not only tests of military might but of endurance, courage, and adaptation. Men had faced storms, darkness, fire, and relentless enemy attacks, learning to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable. Their experiences defined modern naval warfare, where air power, intelligence, and industrial capacity determined outcomes as much as bravery and skill. The lessons forged in these months would resonate through history, shaping naval doctrine and the understanding of total war at sea. As the smoke of gunfire cleared over the Pacific, as survivors clung to rafts and ships sailed onward, the world recognized that the end of conflict was near. The oceans had been both adversary and ally, claiming lives and testing resolve. Yet the courage, skill, and determination of those who fought upon them had carved a path toward victory. The last battles had shown the full scale of human endeavor at sea, and the Pacific, once a theater of fear and uncertainty, now bore witness to the triumph of resilience, strategy, and unwavering resolve. The year was 1945. The war at sea, which had begun with silent hunters in the Atlantic and raging carriers in the Pacific, was drawing to a close. Across the oceans, fleets moved with confidence and purpose, their crews seasoned by years of relentless struggle. The Allies had learned the lessons of endurance, innovation, and courage, and now their mastery of the seas was complete. Yet the cost had been staggering, the human toll immeasurable, and the oceans themselves had been both battlefield and judge. In the Pacific, the final campaigns pressed toward Japan itself. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and countless smaller islands had been captured through a combination of naval bombardment, airstrikes, and amphibious assaults. Each victory was hard-won, each gain a testament to the skill, courage, and endurance of men who had faced the full fury of modern naval warfare. Carriers dominated the horizon, their planes striking with precision, while battleships and cruisers delivered punishing fire upon entrenched positions. Every ship and sailor played a role in the inexorable march toward victory. The industrial might of the Allies had been decisive. Shipyards in the United States had produced thousands of vessels, from small escorts to massive carriers, while factories turned out aircraft, munitions, and supplies at a pace the enemy could not match. This production ensured that losses could be replaced, that fleets could remain at sea, and that operations could continue without pause. The war had become a test not only of courage and skill, but of the capacity of nations to harness every resource toward a common goal. Submarines continued to play a lethal role, sinking enemy ships, disrupting supply lines, and forcing Japanese naval commanders into desperate measures. Depth charges, sonar, and coordination with air patrols had turned the tide in the Atlantic, while in the Pacific, submarines struck with deadly precision against ships isolated by geography or circumstance. The oceans were full of danger and opportunity alike, and those who mastered them shaped the course of history. The human cost of victory was immense. Thousands of sailors, airmen, and Marines had given their lives. Ships were shattered, lives lost to fire, torpedoes, and storms. Survivors carried scars, both visible and hidden, reminders of the horrors endured. Yet in their sacrifice lay the path to freedom, the assurance that tyranny and conquest would not prevail. Every name lost at sea, every life extinguished, was a testament to courage, resilience, and the price of survival. As the war drew to a close, fleets returned to ports, battered but triumphant. Sailors who had faced months or years at sea stepped ashore, many for the first time in years, greeted by families, relief, and the weight of remembrance. The oceans that had been relentless adversaries now became witnesses to reflection and remembrance. The scale of the conflict, the bravery displayed, and the endurance tested became stories passed from generation to generation. the lessons of courage and perseverance preserved in memory and history. The conclusion of the war at sea also brought recognition of the transformations in naval warfare. Carriers and aircraft had replaced battleships as the primary instruments of power. Radar, sonar, and intelligence had proven decisive. Industrial capacity determined outcomes as much as tactics, and human endurance remained the ultimate measure of success. The oceans had become arenas of unprecedented complexity, where every ship, plane, and sailor mattered. Victory was not without its solemnity. The seas remained littered with wreckage, reminders of battles fought and lives lost. Islands bore scars of bombardment and occupation, and countless families mourned those who had perished. Yet from these losses, the world emerged wiser, nations learned the cost of war, and the strategies and technologies developed during the conflict would shape the decades to come. Reflecting on the naval battles of World War II, one sees a story of human determination against immense odds. From the frigid Atlantic convoys to the tropical Pacific campaigns, from the first U-boat attacks to the final strikes on Japanese strongholds, courage, skill, and resolve defined the conflict. The oceans were more than a stage. They were a crucible, testing the limits of men, machines, and nations alike. In the end, the Allied victory at sea ensured the liberation of occupied territories, the protection of supply lines, and the eventual end of tyranny across continents. It was a victory earned through strategy, innovation, industrial might, and the relentless spirit of those who faced the horrors of naval warfare. The oceans, once feared as deadly and unpredictable, had become monuments to courage, endurance, and the indomitable human will. As fleets sailed into harbors, as sailors stepped ashore, and as the world breathed the first breaths of peace in years, the story of World War II at sea was etched into history. It was a story of darkness and fire, of fear and heroism, of human ingenuity against the vast, indifferent power of the oceans. The battles were over, but the lessons remained. The bravery, sacrifice, and determination of those who fought upon the waves would never be forgotten. The oceans had claimed much, but they had also witnessed triumph. The war was over, yet the legacy of courage endured, a testament to the human spirit rising against the fury of the sea.